Again, my name is David Fletcher. I've worked for BHIS for 9 years. I'm a pen tester, and I've done the full spectrum of testing here at BHIS to include automotive and industrial testing. And today, I'm just going to talk to you about Office macro functionality that you might find useful on your tests. So let's talk about our objectives. The one thing that I'm not going to talk about is execution. So spawning new processes, running malware directly from an Office document. We're not going to do those things because there's all kinds of tools out there that try to do them, and that functionality is very well instrumented from the context of EDRs nowadays. So it's less useful to try to use it because a lot of people know about it. They might be blocking those attachments incoming to the organization. And it just doesn't help a whole lot. What I want to do is encourage creative use of macros during your tests. And if we can think about the Office suite as a potential attack platform beyond just initial execution, we might be able to expand tooling options once we've gained access to the environment. So a little bit of history. The reason that I got involved in developing macros for myself is before Bloodhound was released, I used to advocate use of Active Directory Explorer along with one of my fellow coworkers, Sally Vandeven, because it gave wonderful situational awareness regarding Active Directory. At the time, there wasn't a whole lot of tooling to do that sort of analysis. But despite Active Directory Explorer being a great product, it had its limitations. So initially it was view only. So we could take an Active Directory snapshot, we could perform queries against the Active Directory database, but we couldn't easily get information out. Nowadays, we have the Active Directory Explorer ingester for Bloodhound, so we can import that information into Bloodhound and then export it into another form from the graph database, but that just didn't exist at the time. In addition, it was difficult to search. So if I had a large Active Directory that I was running queries against, I might run a wildcard query, and the query would run for maybe a minute or two, and then eventually Active Directory Explorer would just disappear. So that made things hard. Because of those limitations, I started working with Excel, and initially all I was doing was requesting the information that I commonly used during engagements using ODBC in Microsoft Excel macros. At about the same time, Bloodhound was released, and that gave us wonderful capability. So with Bloodhound, we could see all of these relationships in Active Directory. We could get all kinds of temporal information, sessions that existed, and it was very useful for a very long time. But nowadays, with modern Windows, we get less of that telemetry because of the way Windows has been hardened. So we don't get to see session information. We still see a lot of misconfigurations in Active Directory as far as permissions are concerned, but it's just not the same sort of fidelity that existed when we first started. So what was old has now become new, and despite using this for the last almost 10 years reliably, I've decided that I'm just going to throw it out there and see if other people can find it useful, because I've been bolting on additional functionality over time. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you guys a GitHub repo. It's going to have all the things that I talk about in this presentation so that you can go out and try them yourselves. I think I've already mentioned it, but my primary tool of choice is Microsoft Excel. The reason for that is I get this simple tabular format. So when I request information from Active Directory or some other source, I can stick it directly into a table, and I can access that information, and then I can present it to someone in my reporting. In addition, I can hide and unhide content. I'm going to talk about a potential compromise scenario where I find a document that's macro enabled, I poison it, and then I get information out of Active Directory through surrogate execution of the macro by users who normally use it every day. So I can hide and unhide worksheets, columns, and that helps me remain undetected as I'm modifying these documents. On top of that, I get filtering and sorting that everybody probably has used in Access or in Microsoft Excel, and then I can do data manipulation using Excel formulas. So there are a couple of places where I actually do this in the macros that I'm going to be giving out to everybody. The first one is user account control. For a computer account, user account control is going to tell you all kinds of wonderful things about delegation, whether the machine is a domain controller or not. And from the context of a user account, I can see misconfigurations. So things like Kerberos pre-authentication not required. Now I know I can ASREP roast those users when I find them. And then finally, Excel has this wonderful conditional formatting feature. So now I can highlight things so that they appear immediately once they are populated in the workbook itself. What are the benefits of using Office against your organizations? Trusted Microsoft applications. So it's unlikely that somebody's going to stop Excel from working. So I know it's always going to be there. In addition, macros are almost always enabled and used within an organization. So often what we find is parts of an organization like accounting use them commonly. And then if we can find those documents, we can do bad things on behalf of the users that are in those departments. In addition, if my organization under test can detect things like Bloodhound running or other tools in the environment, maybe I want to use some uncommon tooling to see if they can see those specific things happening in their environment as well. I've already mentioned that we get easy visualization of results. Bloodhound's great at displaying temporal data, so I can see where a user is logged on and what path I can take to get there, or permission misconfigurations. But relaying that information to my customer is a little bit more difficult because I have to, take, for example, I look at domain users and see how many machines they have admin on, and there's 50 of them. Now I've got this graph that explodes out to here, and I've got to rearrange everything, and it's still not very easy to read once I get it down to a compact form. In our case, we can just export that information to Excel and then give the organization a table to look at. So I get nice visuals for reporting, and I can easily customize macros because they're all in VBA, and I can just look at the LDAP queries and the parameters that are being retrieved, easily drop my modifications in, and I get all the information that I want. And then finally, we can use the output as a customer resource. So almost always, when I run these macros in an organization's environment, I strip the macros out at the end of the engagement, and I give them the entire Excel workbook. And now they have a starting point to do analysis on their own Active Directory environment if they're not already doing it. What are some useful capabilities exposed by VBA through the Office suite? Well, I can interact with the machine where the macro is executing. So I can gather things like environment variables, running processes, services running on the system. I can also interact with local and remote file systems. So I can read file shares, and I can read the local file system to get information that might help me exploit a machine or a user. And then I can gather information from tons of external data sources. So I have a few listed here, and they're the primary ones that I normally interact with. So Active Directory, SQL Server, Microsoft SharePoint. But as you can see on the slide, there's tons of options under the external data feature on Microsoft Excel. So I can gather all kinds of information. as we're going through this presentation, it's useful to think about how we might be able to use this to generate more modules to get more information back from the environment. So the other thing that's really, really helpful is Microsoft, as they've pushed Microsoft 365, they've included presence information in almost every product. So if I'm using Microsoft 365, I've got SharePoint, OneDrive, file shares, and I can look at the last modification date on those individual files, but I can also see who's editing a document in real time. So if I look at the presence bubble, I can tell who's been messing around with the document, who uses it on a regular basis. And typically what happens is when I get into an environment, one of the first things that I look for in SharePoint or one of the other repositories is macro-enabled documents, and just open a bunch of them and wait and see presence bubbles pop in and pop out. So now I can gather information from Excel because I've got this information about presence and the users using those documents. So when I'm using these macros, I commonly use them on assumed breach testing. In assumed breach, it's really great because I'm modeling a malicious insider. Or I can use them on red teams as well. So from a post-compromise perspective, I might run the macro to gather information from the environment instead of running tools like Bloodhound that might get me caught. When I run these macros that we're going to talk about, I'm going to get information that's very similar, but also extended to Bloodhound DC only output. So I'm going to get all the information that I would normally get from DC only, but it's in tabular form, and I can more easily digest and analyze that information in that form. In addition, if I've got Microsoft 365 only access, so say I've stolen cookies from somebody or I've got credentials and I can log into Microsoft 365, this is a great way to perform advanced reconnaissance against an organization. And finally, we often have organizations ask us to do specialized testing. So on a red team, instead of having us fish users, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, what we want to do is we want to see what can happen when a vendor goes rogue in our organization. We're going to give you the exact same access as a vendor or a partner with credentials, and then just see where you can go with it and see what we can detect with that access. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Often execution of these macros goes undetected. So unless you've got something like Microsoft ATP or another UEBA running in the background, you typically don't see this activity unless you've got, very good controls looking for the things that it's doing. So let's consider an attack scenario. Our attacker gains access to Microsoft 365. There's tons of ways to do it. I can use a reverse proxy to get to steal cookies and credentials. I can phish and dump the browser credential store using a tool like Sharp Chrome, or I can literally just look in Stealer logs. If you're not gathering Stealer log information and analyzing it, it's an excellent idea. We have some folks here at BHIS who do that sort of thing, and it's a wonderful way to get initial access into an organization just by looking. So if you're not familiar, what happens is I store my credentials in a browser like Chrome because it prompts me, hey, do you want to store this password? When I store that password, those credentials are stored in the credential database and protected by DPAPI. With DPAPI, the user can decrypt that database. So if I can get malware running as that user, I can just dump everything that's in that browser credential store to include credentials and cookies. And now I can actually use those credentials from outside of the organization. So once I've gained access to Microsoft 365, I can also search for documents to poison, just like I mentioned on the last slide. So I'm going to go straight to something like SharePoint. I'm going to look for macro-enabled documents, and then I'm going to drop macro logic into those trusted documents. So normally, what's the big hurdle to getting a macro to run when you actually can deliver it to your user? Well, I get maybe a warning with a red box that says, hey, this macro came from some place that you don't necessarily trust. Do you really want to run it? I might also get the little yellow bar at the top of the window that says, this has macro content in it. Do you want to run that? In a trusted document, I'm unlikely to see this or these prompts because the user has already decided that they're going to run those macros, and therefore a purpose that the user already needs. So we don't have to worry about them not clicking our little prompts to run the macro on our behalf. So when I drop this macro logic, typically what I'm going to do is first I'm going to perform a reconnaissance, and then I'm going to look for ways to get remote C2 in the environment. Often, what I end up doing is direct persistence. And we're going to talk about a couple of ways that you can use that are also going to be included in the GitHub repo to use SSH as a direct persistence mechanism with your macro. So with that said, let's first start talking about reconnaissance. With the ability to enumerate processes and environment variables, local services, the local file system, usually the first thing that I'm looking for when I poison a macro within SharePoint or some other repository is details about the user who's executed the macro itself. So rather than trying to run a payload, I want to understand the internal environment more than what I do from the outside. So considering that initial compromise scenario, or the scenario that I presented, we only have access to Microsoft 365. But if we can find a macro-enabled document, we can figure out additional context about the internal environment before we actually try to exploit something. So we grab those process listings, service listings, list the program files entries so that we can understand what's going on the endpoint on the inside of the network. So in that process listing, I'm going to look for things like EDR running on the box. What type is it? What other tools from a security standpoint exist? When I look at program files and program files x86, I'm going to look for those or evidence of those same security tools, but I'm also going to look for other things. So if I see an application that is organization specific, so meaning it was developed by the organization's developers and is branded with the organization's name, I'm likely to delve into that to figure out what binaries are in there. Those are great candidates to try to avoid getting detected by EDR. Why is that? Well, because they're not usually signed by a trusted publisher. So if I pick on one of those applications are likely to be allow listed in both application whitelisting or application control and defensive products. The next thing I'm probably going to look at is the Active Directory configuration. So I want to look at the default domain policy as far as passwords are concerned, figure out if there are any fine-grained password policies, maybe look at the machine account quota and the domain functional level. So for those password policies, if I can use SharePoint and Office to gain more information about the organization, that's going to make me more effective in my external attacks as well. If I know the password policy and I can gather a list of Active Directory users, now I can password spray way more effective than just doing it blindly from generic OSINT data. With machine account quota, if it's set to anything other than 0, I might be able to add a computer account to the domain and then perform attacks that would otherwise not be available. And then finally, with the domain functional level, this is just to help us understand what attacks are going to be available to us in general. So depending on the domain functional level, different attributes exist in Active Directory. And if those attributes don't exist, I won't be able to execute attacks that rely on them to be present. A really good example is shadow credentials. So if I'm not at least Server 2016 domain functional level, I can't run the shadow credentials attack. Next thing I'm typically going to look for is user details. So I'm going to gather all the information from Active Directory that I can get on users. Again, this is very much the same information that we get from Bloodhound, just presented in a different form. But in tabular form, I can much more easily digest things from a high-level perspective than I can trying to kind of navigate through the graph interface. So things that I often look for, credentials in attributes. So we commonly find credentials in the comment, description, info, and other attributes in Active Directory that can help us potentially gain access to other user accounts. The other thing we always want to pay attention to is password last set. Users with the oldest passwords in the environment are typically going to have the weakest passwords. So if I'm doing something like service principal name analysis, I can look at that password last set date and specifically pick on the accounts that have the oldest passwords. So now I don't run like a Kerberos attack against the entire organization. I just pick those specific accounts and then run them on some interval that's going to, go below the threshold of detection within the environment. And then finally, I'm going to take a look at user account control. So if you look at the top screen capture in the slide, user account control is an integer in Active Directory. It's all a bitwise field. So if I break down those individual bits, I can see the specific configurations that are applied to an account. That's going to include password not required, pre-auth not required, reversible encryption, password never expires. So now I can see exactly what's going on with each individual user account. The most useful one in here is going to be password or pre-auth not required. So I can AS rep roast specific users in the environment with this misconfiguration. Next, I'll look at computer details. So I always want to identify the domain controllers in the environment, and we can do that with user account control. And here I've used Excel formulas to pick out those specific bits and present them right in the worksheet. Then we want to do some metadata analysis. The things that I often find the most useful in here are operating system and password last set. So with operating system, under normal circumstances, every machine in Active Directory that is an actual Windows box is going to register its operating system when it joins the domain. If I see entries with operating system missing, I'm immediately going to be suspicious of those machines. So instead of interacting with those boxes early on in my engagement, what I'm typically going to do is avoid those boxes like they're the plague until I get towards the end of my engagement, and then maybe interact with them if I'm desperate. The other thing I like to look at is password last set. In a modern or in a standard Windows Active Directory, computers change their passwords every 30 days. If I see a password last set date older than a couple of months, then either that machine is a stale account in Active Directory, or it's potentially something like a honeypot. That's another great way to avoid interacting with things that you probably shouldn't touch on the network. Again, I will assess all of these resources near the end of my engagement, but early on, I want to be as quiet as possible. The final thing that I typically look for is service principal names. So with the service principal name on a computer account, I can figure out generically what services are exposed on that machine itself. So I might be able to perform follow-on activity with those machines. Then I gather all kinds of other information from Active Directory to include members of sensitive groups, domain trust information. Sites and services can be useful to understand network boundaries if they've been populated. DFS shares gives you a place to start for looking for sensitive content. But the macro can be used to perform cross-domain targeting as well. So very much like you would use the -D switch in Sharphound or Bloodhound. So in addition, with Excel, we can perform interactive analysis. So I'm scouring the domain. I see that people are logging into my specific or using the documents that I want to poison. I can use those users to get information on the individuals who are using the document. So I can, in this case, I can drop a username in the username to query cell, run the macro, and then it pulls back all the information that I would want to see about that user as far as group membership and details about the user account. It works very much like the net command, but I don't have to run the net command anymore if I've got access to Microsoft Excel. Taking things a little bit further and getting more active on the network beyond just performing LDAP queries, we can gather interesting artifacts from other resources. So for instance, think about group policy. Every machine on the network is going to scan the policy share every 90 to 120 minutes. So this activity doesn't look very suspicious from the context of Active Directory itself. It just looks like a policy scan. But we can identify objects in Active Directory group policy, such as scripts, browser shortcuts, map network drives, and custom policy files that might help us with follow-on attacks. So usually the organization is going to include browser shortcuts for all the important things in the environment that everybody should have access to. So I can just gather that information and use that as next steps for my test before becoming extremely active and doing things like share enumeration or scanning for different resources on the network. In this case, what we mostly see are map network drive policies. So the macro is literally going out to the policy share, recursing all of the subdirectories, picking out specific XML files, and then parsing out the bits that we want. Here, we have the UNC path and the drive letter that's being assigned to every share. Usually this is arbitrated by group membership. So if I'm not in a specific group, I don't get to see those drive mappings. Instead, now I'm just parsing it all and I get to see everybody's drive mappings as long as I can read the policy, which is usually the case. The next thing I've got here is another macro that tests Microsoft SQL Server Access. I don't know how many people have used PowerUp SQL on a test, but typically the way that this works is I gather computer names from Active Directory with SPNs that have MS SQL SVC in them. When I extract all of those computer names, I try to connect to each one. And then if I'm successful in connecting, I list the databases. So this is a great way to try to move laterally, identify sensitive content, and escalate privileges on the network. And instead of having to run a tool like PowerUp SQL, I can just run it directly from Excel and then once I've identified that I've gained access to a specific database, I can interactively explore those databases using Excel's native functionality. If remember the external data menu, I can literally just go to get data from database, from SQL Server Database, enter the database that I'm trying to connect to, meaning the server IP address or host name, and then the actual database itself. Typically, I always default to master and then just see what kind of access I can get. Then I can specify credentials. Under normal circumstances, I'm going to run this macro as the user who is executing the document. That way, I get all the information that they, or all of the instance information that they have access to. However, I can change those credentials to be specific databases. So now, if I find credentials on the network for a Microsoft SQL database, I don't have to scramble to find a third-party tool or a server that I can log into that has SQL Server Management Studio. I can just use Excel's functionality to connect directly to it. So once I've specified my credentials, the database navigator pops up, exposing the tables that are in the database that I'm connected to. And then finally, I can use the query browser to look at the information in that database. So no longer do I have to figure out where I can use my SQL creds. I can use them on any machine that has Office 365 installed. In addition, so I've talked about a lot of the baseline functionality in the macros that I'm going to be sharing. One of the really nice things is I can run this through a proxy just like I can any other tooling. So I think most testers have gotten used to using SOX proxies through either C2 or SSH. And we can do the same thing with our Microsoft 365 instance. So I can install a tool like Proxifier. Then I can use Proxifier to target the Excel process. And what that's going to do is it's going to force all of the traffic from Excel over the SOX proxy into the target network. Now I specify the remote domain controller in the macro and spawn a shell using net only with my compromised credentials. Remember, our scenario was we get access to Microsoft 365, and now we have credentials for the user through browser store credential dumping. Well, now we execute that macro as the user on an external system that's not joined to the domain, and we can still get the same information out. Now that I've talked about Reconnaissance, let's think about how we might use this Excel macro content or the Excel macro features to establish direct persistence within the environment. So rather than trying to drop malware to disk directly from the macro, which is something that I used to do. So what I used to do is we would generate payloads. We would base64 encode the content, reverse the base64 encoded string, stick it in the actual body of the macro, and then when the macro would execute, it would just drop the malware to disk and then execute the malware in the background. Well, it's really hard to get away with that because now Microsoft is like, your macro has a ton of base64 encoded content in it. We're just going to assume that it's malicious. However, on modern Windows hosts, we get the wonderful open SSH package on system. So it's commonly accessible through SSH and SFTP and SCP on the host. And what we find is, especially during assumed breach testing, we always do an egress scan. So if I see ports that I can connect to outbound across the internet, I'm likely to try to SSH over any one of those ports. In reality, in most environments, outbound SSH on TCP port 443 is typically successful. So what I do is I set up a VPS and I configure either a tunnel-only user or an SFTP-only user so that when I drop my private key on the compromised host, I can do things in the background. So I'm creating a restricted user so that I'm literally giving the blue team my key if they discover what's going on. I absolutely don't want them to be able to log into my machine and do bad things as far as analysis is concerned with my box. So instead, I create this restricted user, drop the key on the compromised host, and then use SSH to do things like retrieve my payload file or start a reverse SSH tunnel. Remember, we have credentials for the user account. So if we can tunnel traffic into the network, then we can do whatever we want, just using tools with proxy chains like we would normally do through C2. So what does that restricted user creation look like? The first thing I'm going to do is create a user on the box, maybe add them to a couple of groups specifically for SFTP only. I'm going to generate an SSH key. And the shorter the public key string for the SSH key, the better, because I don't want Defender going crazy because I've got base64 encoded content in my macro. So I typically pick something like ED25519 for my key, and then I add that key to authorized keys in my new user, and I configure SSH to listen on the desired port. When I do automatic file retrieval for direct persistence, typically I'm going to add a little banner, and I'm not going to suppress display of the window. And that banner is shown at the bottom. Hey, we're updating software on your machine. Please don't close this window. It's going to close automatically once we're done. So what does that macro SSH abuse actually look like? Now we find our document that's that people are using often in Microsoft 365. Well, that was interesting. And when the macro fires, we drop our SSH key into a user accessible location, like downloads. The file can be named whatever we want it to be named, as long as it's got an SSH private key in it. So it doesn't have to be absolutely obvious, like ID_RSA. Next, we drop an LNK file into a useful location on the endpoint. A couple of locations that directly come to mind are the startup folder. So if I drop an LNK file in the startup folder, every time the user logs onto the box, that the target of that LNK file gets executed. That can be a malicious binary that I've dropped on the box. That can be SSH for an outbound reverse tunnel. It can also be a lull bin to execute my payload from a signed binary. In addition, I could drop an LNK file to the desktop and establish hotkey persistence. So with hotkey persistence, I set the shortcut key in the shortcut to something like Control-V. Every time a user pastes content into an application, I get a new shell instance back. What do our LNK contents look like? Typically, I'm going to use something like a command to retrieve my payload and then directly execute it. Or I'm going to copy the payload directly into a location on disk where I know I can hijack a DLL or sideload a DLL. Or I'm just going to use that SSH reverse tunnel. Whatever works best for you based on the reconnaissance that you've gathered in the first stages of execution. Now I'm going to provide a couple of examples of those LNK commands that I would drop into my, my macro. So in the first instance, we're using SFTP. We're setting strict host checking to accept new. What that's going to do is it's going to suppress the little dialog that says, hey, I've been presented this fingerprint from this remote SSH server. Should I accept it? Here, it just accepts all new connections. Next, I'm going to use hash known hosts and set it to yes. What that does is if I connect to an SSH server under normal circumstances, I drop a new entry into the known host file. If it's not hashed, then it's plain text, which means that my IP address of my remote host is directly in known hosts. If I hash them, now I can see which hosts that I've visited, but I can't easily see the IP address directly in the known host file. So if I'm a defender, I can't rely on what's on the endpoint to tell me exactly where I'm connecting. Obviously, I can see it in execution of the command, but if I change that IP address associated with the host name, maybe they can't pick that stuff apart directly. Obviously, they can also see it from the network side. So in this case, I'm going to use SFTP to connect on port 443 with my key to connect to evil.com and retrieve version.dll. I'm going to drop version.dll into C users username app data local Microsoft Teams current version.dll. That's a known sideload for Microsoft Teams. So if I drop my DLL in there, when Teams spawns, my payload executes. For a tunnel-only SSH connection, I'm going to run pretty much the same options, but I'm going to use TAC-N, TAC-R 9050. What that's going to do is I'm going to establish the connection with no input, and I'm going to establish a reverse tunnel on TCP port 9050. On my VPS, what I'm going to see is a local port open on 9050, and now I can run all of my tooling with proxy chains targeting that port to get information back into my traffic into the network. Finally, another one that I've used often is UNC path lateral movement. So I feed it my lull bin and then my target. My target is going to be an internal SMB share. When I drop my payload on the SMB share, one of the things that I'm going to look for is those custom binaries. So in my initial analysis, when I'm doing file share enumeration and sensitive content discovery, I'm totally going to look at the places where you keep software to identify things that I might be able to impersonate to get away with going undetected on the network. So for that post-compromise lateral movement, usually I already have access to the environment, but I want to get somewhere else. So I'm going to drop my payload on an SMB share, looking for those custom binaries. I'm going to poison an existing macro-enabled document, and then I'm going to use the link file to establish that persistence on the remote machine, and then drop my actual execution in the LNK targets. So we've talked about reconnaissance in the organization using Excel. We've talked a little bit about actually spawning access within the environment using Excel. Some takeaways from this is, from an offensive perspective, be creative with Microsoft 365 product access. If you've got access to SharePoint, use it to your advantage. Figure out how you can get users to execute reconnaissance activities on your behalf so that they have to work hard to identify where that stuff is coming from. Make sure you're checking access to internal resources once you're inside the network, and think creatively about how you're going to establish initial access within the environment and move laterally. So that kind of covers all the things that I've talked about here, but the challenge is to consider other ways that you might be able to use these features in a nefarious fashion, and then share them back with the community. From a defensive perspective, This is a great tool to use to better understand your environment, especially in organizations where offensive tools are prohibited. So instead of recommending that somebody uses something like Bloodhound on the inside of their environment, when their security team literally freaks out if they see Bloodhound running, we might be able to use something like Office to provide value back to the organization. On top of that, we want to consider, disabling macros where they aren't needed, or looking for options like code signing to restrict who can actually execute that content. The final thing that I want to talk about is some credits. The Git repository for this webcast is going to be right here. Oops. On top of that, this webcast wouldn't have been possible without use of tools like Game of Active Directory and Bad Blood. If you haven't played with GoAD, then you should actually take some time out. It's a pre-configured, intentionally vulnerable Active Directory environment. And the blog that goes along with GoAD has really great content to walk you through each one of the scenarios that are presented by the environment. On top of that, so the content that was generated by GoAD is a little bit sparse. So I wanted to have more users and groups and Active Directory structure. So I used Bad Blood as well. And Bad Blood is a tool for generating new content in an existing Active Directory. So what I can do is I can inject all kinds of bad things like misconfigurations, user accounts with credentials in Active Directory attributes, all kinds of nasty stuff into my Active Directory itself. I used both of those so that I got useful content out of my macro execution. Now that leads us to the section where I can either, demo, or we can ask and answer some questions. Unfortunately, I don't know if that demo part is actually going to work because stupid Zoom keeps crashing when I screen share.
So we'll just do questions. Good job, Fletch. Well done. You made it. Didn't crash. It was definitely roll the dice there for a bit.
Yeah, I was nervous. Oh, and Zoom is trying to crash on me again.
They I don't know if they saw you, but they definitely heard you throughout the entire thing. So I just screenshotted a picture of your face so they could just look at you while you were talking. But well done. There are a couple questions, and Sean's back too, so he's gonna help answer some of those as well. Thank you guys for joining us. Okay, so some questions. What if these Excel sheets have Python allowed? You might have already answered that, or you might have dropped completely. Sean.
Stupid Zoom.
Stupid Zoom. Definitely blaming the Zoom. Yeah, he's trying to come back, folks.
They have
Sean,
hyphen allowed. Not sure I understand the question. Let me see if I can get some context here.
I'm back. It crashed hard that time. Every other time it restarted.
Nice.
What was the question?
What if these Excel sheets have Python allowed? I'm not sure the context of that.
Python allowed. I misheard. Okay.
So I haven't played with any of the Python Microsoft 365 functionality up to this point. It didn't exist, and I'm not sure if it exists yet. But at the time that I started putting this all together, VBA was the only thing that existed.
Wonderful. Okay, for credentials stored in attributes, how do you determine which of those accounts could be cyber deception honey accounts?
Usually it's looking at the password last set date, the logon count, things like that. So I gather in the Excel macros that I'm making available through the GitHub repo, I gather all that information because those are going to be dead giveaways. If logon count is really low, and this is supposed to be an active user and the password was set years ago, then it might not be worth interacting with it. But that's the problem with cyber deception, is it's deceptive. And it's intentionally so. So sometimes you got to take a chance.
Yeah, well said, for sure. This attack does not work if the macros should be signed by an organization, or is there a bypass as well for this?
There might be a bypass, but I can count on this many fingers how many organizations have restricted me with macro signing. And I've been doing this for like 10 years and using it on almost every engagement.
That wasn't many fingers, you're very right.
No, that wasn't many fingers at all.
If anyone has any other questions that we have not covered, feel free to post them in the Discord. And Sean, if you see any, just jump right in, buddy.
I did get an interesting question. Could this kind of attack be used in Google Sheets?
I haven't even investigated it. I don't know that Google Sheets has macro functionality equivalent to Microsoft 365. And I would be hard pressed to think that they have like the VBA subsystem exposed, because it's a completely different environment. Yeah, that's a great question.
Makes sense.
Are you sure that last link for the GitHub is correct? There's a couple people saying that it goes to 404.
I haven't made it public yet. Hold on one sec. I'm logging in. When everything crashed, you know, everything
Explain it.
fell apart for me.
It's just not your day, my friend. Please come
No,
back to
especially
another one.
it's funny because it was rock solid for an hour during pre-show.
It's totally fine. Yeah, totally fine. Of course, but that's right.
Got a couple questions about Stealer logs. Can you briefly talk about where would somebody go to find Stealer logs and how they could query those?
I want to say, did Corey do a webcast on Stealer logs?
Oh, I feel like he would have or should
I
have.
think he did. So
Okay.
Corey and Alice are our primary OSINT, data collectors. And I know there's, a ton of different places to look, and they tend to gather those things and make them available to us. I would assume that places like Pastebin are some of the places that they would go, and they probably monitor the socials quite rigorously to identify breaches where Stealer logs have been posted.
That makes sense.
I don't see any other questions. So if you have any more, just pop them in there. If not, then we'll have Fletch kind of wrap up and we'll do a little post show. Be careful with Pastebin, yes. Well, Fletch, if you could sum up the last hour of you teaching us about fun with macros in just a short little final thoughts with Fletch, what would they be?
Be creative about the things that are exposed to you within a given environment. There are ways to abuse almost everything. And I can probably count on one hand how many times execution of the macros that I talked about have been identified in an environment. And usually they get identified through tools like, Defender for Identity or ATP or other UEBA products that are not really widely deployed.
Well said. They want you to do a class on this, my friend.
But I probably could.
Just added many hours to your workload. That's a compliment. They really enjoyed it.
Let me take a look at my slides real quick there, Deb.
For the GitHub? Okay. All right.
Yeah, I can't remember if I updated the URL. Yes, I did not update the URL. Damn it.
You're consistent today.
I am consistently wrong.
Yeah, consistently a challenge. Fine.
So it is named the same as my actual presentation. It's fun with Office macros. not fun with macros.
Okay. We'll fix it. We'll fix it in the slides. And then we'll post it again. We do have a request to play a song on your mandolin to sing us out.
I can't play a song to sing. I can't play a song on the mandolin.
Maybe banjo, guitar. There you go. I knew it was close by.
And I'm gonna sing.
Sure.
You're asking a lot of me.
You can say no.
Nice.
I doubt that anybody knows this song. Just told him, Mom. Oh, Brian says it's not coming through.
It's not. Your voice was, but we'll have to practice next time. This was definitely doing it live, which is very on par for us. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Black Hills Information Security webcast. As always, we do this on Thursdays at 1 or noon, 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock. I can't get, I see it's consistent. We're consistently off today, all of us. So, but thank you for joining us, and we'll be here next week. Brian, you have one job, buddy. Kill with fire. Kill it.